Good afternoon, everyone. The lectures today are going to have the common topic of stress physiology. And the first one is actually an introductory lecture to the Hpa Axis, which, as you know, means the Hypothalamus Pituitary Adrenal Axis. The Hypothalamus Pituitary Adrenal Axis consists of a cascade of events in which a different substance, a different molecule is released, starting at the hypothalamus, at the base of the brain, where the release of corticotropin-releasing hormone, also called CRH, as a result of different factors, could be a circadian rhythm. Most hormones actually fluctuate daily, and that means that patterns of light and dark, for example, can affect them. And also, and most importantly, in relation with this lecture, is stress. Stress causes the hypothalamus to release CRH, which in turn, after being released from the hypothalamus, reaches the pituitary gland, in particular the anterior pituitary gland, where ACTH, the adrenocorticotropic hormone, is going to be released from. ACTH is then released into the bloodstream, circulating in the blood, eventually reaches the adrenal cortex, where it causes the release of glucocorticoids. If we talk about some species, I'll mention that later, cortisol or corticosterone. What's important for you to understand is that it is from the adrenal cortex, the outer part of the adrenal, that glucocorticoids are released from. In the anterior pituitary, there are plenty of different cell types, and each cell type actually is responsible for the secretion of one hormone. The pituitary, in reality, is actually the endocrine control center of the body. And many hormones are actually released by action from pituitary hormones. What we are going to be concentrating in this lecture is the population of corticotroph cells that secrete or produce ACTH and other smaller hormones, as we will see. The target for ACTH and other hormones released from the corticotrophs is essentially the adrenal gland, the cortex of the adrenal gland, but also adipocytes and melanocytes. I'm not going to be covering the rest of the pituitary hormones because that's not part of this lecture. This is a blurry picture of the different hormones that are actually produced in the anterior pituitary. And you will recognize, or you should recognize, many names. Prolactin, FSH, and LH, the follicle-stimulating hormone, and the luteinizing hormone, both of them called generically gonadotropins. And here is the key one, the one that actually this lecture is about, ACTH. What's important from these cascades of hormones is that each of these hormonal sequences you have here starts at the level of the hypothalamus, from where a releasing hormone is released, and then there is a negative feedback effect caused by the same terminal hormones. In other words, cortisol or glucocorticoids will have a negative feedback effect on the pituitary and even on the hypothalamus on the release of these hormones. ACTH is actually, as I said, produced in corticotroph hormones, in corticotroph cells of the pituitary. And the important thing to understand is that it's released, actually it's produced in the form of a very long molecule with a very long name. The precursor of ACTH is actually called pro-opiomelanocortin, pre-pump. What you have in this picture is POMC, pro-opiomelanocortin, because a bit has already disappeared by post-translational cleavage. POMC, pro-opiomelanocortin, then is cleaved into different bits, of which one of them, the red bit here, is actually the hormone that is of interest, ACTH. Of interest is for you to recognize that also in POMC there are other neuropeptide products that are produced, beta and gamma lipotropin, and most importantly, because it's part of this lecture as well, beta endorphins. Also alpha MSH, alpha melanocyte stimulating hormone, which is part of the ACTH molecule. The question is in which, because what you see here is that ACTH can be cleaved into alpha MSH. Obviously, the cleavage of this hormone here, releasing alpha MSH with specific properties, will occur in some tissues but not in others. So the breakdown into smaller molecules here is tissue specific. ACTH at the end is a 39 amino acid peptide. It regulates the adrenal cortex for the synthesis of glucocorticoids. Alpha MSH, which is part of this molecule, is much shorter, only 13 amino acids. It stimulates melanocytes, and you know that melanocytes are those skin cells that produce skin pigmentation. We know, because of this relationship between MSH and ACTH, that overproduction of ACTH as a result of a disease, for example, can result on hyperpigmentation. The classical example is Cushing Syndrome. Cushing Syndrome is usually produced by a tumor in the area of the brain, the pituitary, producing ACTH. If there is an excess production of ACTH, there will be most likely also an excess production of alpha melanocyte stimulating hormone, and then it results in the hyperpigmentation. Hyperpigmentation is the least of a problem in a Cushing's syndrome patient, of course, but this is just part of it. How is ACTH regulated? Well, ACTH is stimulated by CRH, corticotropin-releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, but also by vasopressin. Vasopressin is also called antidiuretic hormone, ADH. Stress is the most important effector for the release of ACTH, but also hypoglycemia. Hypoglycemia meaning low sugar in the blood will also target the release of ACTH. Both CRH and vasopressin are synthesized in the hypothalamus and from there released into the portal circulation, and they reach the hypothalamus this way. Not the hypothalamus, of course, the hypophysis. Important, and that's something that is usually forgotten when we discuss physiology, is that most hormones are actually released in a circadian pattern. That means that the production in the morning is not the same than the production in the afternoon or at night. The highest levels of cortisol, natural endogenous cortisol, are actually seen in the morning following the ACTH release. That means that there is a pattern, a regular natural pattern of ACTH release which peaks in the morning, and after that there is a peak in cortisol. And this is actually a pattern that is opposed to the pattern in growth hormone. Growth hormone secretion does the opposite. Growth hormone peaks later in the day, and it's lowest in the morning. Here you have a schematic picture of the same thing. Factors that actually stimulate the production of ACTH here, stress, sleep-wake cycles associated with these diurnal rhythms. You have also then the release from the pituitary of ACTH, which triggers the adrenal to release cortisol. But notice, and this is important, that after the release of cortisol, cortisol itself, or ACTH on the other hand, can have the negative feedback effect. Cortisol has a negative feedback effect on the pituitary or the hypophysis, but also on the hypothalamus, the same thing that ACTH has here. And another detail, beta endorphins have an inhibitory effect on the negative feedback. So you have an inhibition of an inhibitory action. An inhibition of an inhibitory action means less inhibition, therefore you could say stimulation or facilitation. What are the effects of ACTH? The ACTH acts on the adrenal cortex and it stimulates its growth, but also, and most important, it stimulates the production, the synthesis of steroid hormones, in particular glucocorticoids. And here you have a nice graph picture from a study in sheep, in which the authors measure the effect or the release of different hormones when these sheep are put in a transport for 2 hours. So at time 60, during the first hour, these are control measures, and then these animals are transported in a truck for 2 hours. And what we see here is what happens to the different levels of hormones. In the top graph, you have the release of AVP, arginine vasopressin, or in the diamond sign, so then basically the top dot is vasopressin. The bottom here, the diamond sign, is CRH. What do you see? That upon the start of transportation, there is an increase, an elevation in the levels of both CRH and vasopressin. In the bottom graph, we have basically the production of ACTH and also the production of cortisol. And as you expect, ACTH starts first. There is an increase in the production of ACTH, peaking after about 30 minutes. And then there is a progressive increase in the production of cortisol that picks up after about 1 hour, 1.5 hours, and then go down. So this is the characteristic acute response to stress from the release of ACTH. Peaking of cortisol within a relative period. It's relatively shorter lived, and you could say that after 4 hours after, or 2 hours after the end of transportation, these levels go almost back down to baseline. So this is rather an acute exposure to a stressor, in this case loading the sheep in a truck, transporting them for a couple of hours, and then just downloading them. You see that after 2 hours, these effects go back to baseline. In case if you don't have the negative feedback, notice of course, and that's what you can start appreciating here, because as ACTH peaks, ACTH will start exerting the negative feedback effect, and then what you expect is that when ACTH peaks, CRH levels will start going down. The same thing for cortisol. Both of them have the negative feedback effect on CRH here. In the absence of a negative feedback, what you have is an aberrantly high, an excessively high levels of ACTH, and then you can have the associated problems with that, which we will discuss later. This is just a very simplified picture of the adrenal cortex, a picture here of the actual looks of the adrenal glands in humans. This is about 3 centimeters. Each adrenal gland weighs between 5 and 6 grams, so it's a rather small gland, but it's extremely important for the actions that we have talked about and that we will continue discussing. And this is basically the pathway by which cortisol is produced. And of course, like all other steroids, aldosterone, corticoid, cortisol, but then you also have the gonadal steroids, the sex hormones, arise from the molecule of cholesterol. By different modifications, chemical modifications, you end up with the final glucocorticoid cortisol, or the other corticosterone. That, as you know, depends on which species we are talking about. When we are discussing, we're talking about fish and non-rodent mammals, the main glucocorticoid is cortisol. But for amphibians, reptiles, birds, and rodents, corticosterone is actually the main glucocorticoid. Again, emphasizing on the important concept of feedback, this is the picture that you saw earlier. Cortisol has these negative feedback effects. And finally, as a result, what is the result from glucocorticoid secretion, the secretion of cortisol? You have effects on the target organs that are the immune system, the liver, the muscle, and the adipose tissue. And in these cases, the main response is one of making energy available, increasing energy availability. In the liver, cortisol, or any other glucocorticoid, promotes gluconeogenesis, the formation of glucose de novo. In the muscle, it promotes protein catabolism, breakdown of proteins in terms of making amino acids available for gluconeogenesis. And finally, in the adipose tissue, it promotes lipolysis. So in all these cases, we are talking about a metabolic activation. making energy available to the rest of the tissues of the body. In the case of the immune system, and you see this by this red box, essentially we know that the response of the immune system is suppression of the response, reduction of inflammation, histamine release, and an overall reduction in immunity. And obviously you can already foresee that this is going to be part of the problem in a stress response, as we will be discussing later. And that's it. That's the end for this lecture. Thank you very much for listening.